What is going on, everyone? Welcome to Locked On Badgers. Great show today. We're going to talk about which of the recruits in this class we have to worry about most in terms of potentially decommitting in the wake of the Paul Chryst decision. Have a great guest on. All of that and more on today's Locked On Badgers. Let's go.
You are Locked On Badgers, your daily podcast on the Wisconsin Badgers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, what is going on, Badger fans? Welcome to Locked On Badgers. I am your host, Ryan Herrings. As always, thank you so much for making this your first listen every day, your team every single day on the Locked On Network. Today's show is brought to you by our good friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Underdog Fantasy is the best way to play new college football fantasy. Sign up on UnderdogFantasy.com, promo code Locked On. Get your first deposit doubled up to $100. And like I said, we're going to get right into it. We're bringing John Garcia Jr. back on the show, Sports Illustrated recruiting director, Locked On's college football recruiting insider, and always good when you can join the show. And man, I was just telling you off air, last time we talked, I was just trying to figure out who the quarterback was, not what's going on with our head coach, who can we keep in the class. Welcome to the show. It's been a minute.
Yeah, absolutely. Good to check back in with you, Ryan. Yeah, busy times in Badgerland, but look, things could be worse. I mean, just scanning some of these other schools that have let go their coaches, seems like they're dealing with a lot more drama, whether it's still trying to figure things out on the field or certainly in recruiting. I think Wisconsin's situation appears to be a little bit less dramatic, which is probably what the doctor ordered.
Yeah, I actually want to start there. I think that's really interesting. Wisconsin is going on 4 weeks now with an interim coach. Interim, I use in quotation marks because a lot of people think Leonard will be the guy. But how unusual is it, especially at a Power 5 program, to see a head coach get let go and to see no decommits?
It's very unusual. I mean, we're seeing, of course, some of the schools that have already let go their coaches. We're already seeing those kids decommit kind of at a normal clip, but we're even seeing kids decommit from schools with coaches on the hot seat, right? Auburn continues to lose commitments. Louisville's got a couple that are on flip watch here at this point. West Virginia's lost verbal commitments with their coach on the hot seat. So we usually see it almost as a preemptive move, just as much as we see it as a reciprocator to an actual firing. But here's Wisconsin, no decommitments, 2-1 since making the coaching change, and a lot of the recruits appear to be kind of the same, just as they were before this move was made. Certainly they're paying attention. Certainly you would imagine most are rooting for Jim Leonhard to get the job, as you alluded to. But other than that, it appears as if most of them are going to stay put more likely than not. Others have picked up scholarship offers, and there's going to be visits, and it could get dramatic for a few. But the majority of the class, it looks like, is going to try to stick through this thing until an official decision comes down, and then kind of the reassessment portion of the process will happen. So that is a rarity. We see it every single year. Last year we saw 20 Power 5 jobs change. And again, before the moves were made, there were decommitments, and certainly after, there were droves of decommitments in certain cases. I think of Oklahoma, Oregon. So a lot of these schools lost half their class or more. So to be in the zero column on the decommitment side at this point, like you said, almost a month into it, is a really big deal. And I do think says a lot about Wisconsin, right? We've talked about it for months, right? When the Wisconsin offer comes, it's never about one coach or one person. It's about a culture. It's about a winning reputation and perception that appears to be sustained through multiple coaches, through multiple eras of college football, through all the shifts in conference realignment and the Big Ten, all of that. Wisconsin has been a constant on the plus side of it. So I think all of that tied in with Madison being a great town, the academics, just keeps Wisconsin there on a high level. And I think that is another example as to just the power of the brand itself.
Yeah, I think Badger fans love hearing that, man, especially from a national guy kind of speaking to that power of the Motion W, the brand itself. Do you think it also may and I agree with, I think Wisconsin targets a certain type of person, and I think they recruit a certain type of way. Do you think it also maybe speaks to some programs where the head coach is more involved in recruiting? And I don't want to turn that into a Paul Chryst wasn't recruiting thing, but, maybe the recruiters on the staff are more still there, and Paul Chryst was more of the CEO type.
That's a good point as well. I think there is, it's different when there's an expectation of a promotion. I look at Notre Dame. I think that's probably the best program to link this to in terms of recent history. Brian Kelly surprises everyone, takes the LSU job, and then immediately there's this campaign for Marcus Freeman, right? Defensive coordinator, former player, young recruiter. I mean, a lot of similarities here to Jim Leonhard. There's an immediate campaign for him, and boom, it just binds the class. I think they lost one kid after that transition. So I see this very similarly when there's, again, a guy who, and in Jim Leonhard's case, a guy more tied to the school, right?
For sure.
I mean, Freeman had just got there, I think a year prior, up and coming name in the biz and all that, but he played at Ohio State. Jim Leonhard is Wisconsin through and through. So I think that adds even another layer of expectation with him potentially grabbing this job, full time. So I do think that it creates a more benefit of the doubt situation for these recruits because they know these recruiters, right? And there's the potential not only for Jim Leonhard to stay, but again, just like Notre Dame, a lot of these assistants potentially have an opportunity to stay put, whether it's Poteet, Ingram, certainly, certain position coaches you feel, better about compared to others. I mean, up on the offensive line, Bostad, I think he's one that, a lot of kids expect to stay. And with that reputation at that position, it would start to make sense. So I think that creates a little bit more of a hesitation with these kids instead of making these moves immediately after a decision is to be made. But it's still, that clarity is still certainly anticipated and needed before these decisions get closer to being finalized.
Yeah, I think that's really, really well said. I want to jump into, there's a couple commits in particular I want to ask you about. We're going to start with the receiver out of Bishop Gorman, Trech Kekahuna, 2023 kid, obviously out of Hawaii originally, St. Louis, right. The powerhouse out there, transferred to Bishop Gorman. He's kind of blown up this year, got some offers, Sharks are circling. What have you heard about him recently?
Yeah, I think when you make that move to Bishop Gorman, you're on a bigger stage and you're competing at a high clip, and he's been incredibly productive, averaging, I think, almost 100 yards a game as a receiver on top of that. So, yeah, naturally, the Pac-12 schools have lurked. I remember coming on this show, and you're like, hey, his only Power 5 offer is Wisconsin. Do you think this is something that, Wisconsin is settling for? I'm like, well, he's in Hawaii. He's a slot receiver. He's more of a niche kind of prospect. Let's see what happens when he gets a little bit more, tape under his belt. And look, Oregon is in, a bunch of Pac-12 programs are in. I believe he already took a visit up to Oregon, so that's probably the school you keep the closest eye on. Anytime you talk about elite Hawaiians going to the Pac-12, Oregon's one of the schools that pops up. Marcus Mariota pops in your head certainly early in that conversation. So with their reputation at that position, I do think Oregon is a program to keep an eye out for. But again, he's still saying the right things on top of it, right? You expect more status quo from the Midwestern commits and probably the defensive commits because of Jim Leonhard and in general. But here's a West Coast, Islander, wide receiver, just, nondescript Wisconsin lean kind of guy. And he's still saying the right things about Wisconsin. He believes in the direction of the program, including how this decision goes down with the coaching staff. So it could be as simple as, do my recruiters stick or do they not? But also Oregon, I do think is in and of itself is something that is very intriguing to him. So more offers are coming in. He could take more visits going forward, but certainly the Ducks are the program to keep an eye on.
Yeah, I want to finish up with Trech really quick. For those who we talked about Bishop Gorman being a high-level program, he because a lot of people just look at the commitment rankings on a 247 or Rivals, whatever.
Sure.
Trech is the bottom-ranked commit in Wisconsin's class, and he is at a next level in Bishop Gorman. What is that talent like at that high school? How impressive is what he's doing this year?
Well, look, they've got the number one slot receiver in the country at that high school, Zach Branch, the USC verbal commitment, and he has been nearly as productive as he has. The quarterback's getting recruited, the running backs are getting recruited, multiple linemen are getting recruited. This is, a totally different deal than St. Louis High School, where he's the guy. So to elevate your game and play productively, similarly to what you were doing at your previous school there, says it's a big deal. It's like doing it at IMG or Mater Dei or St. John Bosco. Gorman is still one of those schools. St. Francis, I would put in that category. It's still one of those schools that you were expected to be good at your old school, and then when you get to the big school, it's like you got to level off at some point. So the recruits who don't and remain incredibly productive, they often see a pretty big boom on their offer list. And it's really just a tribute to him, right? Because this was a kid, again, Wisconsin was his first Power 5 offer. He jumped on it pretty quickly, and that was it. It was like Mountain West or Wisconsin. And now all of a sudden there's a lot of Pac-12 options. Other schools are getting involved there as well. So again, I think it does reveal that when you do it at a high level, there's a benefit of the doubt at these brand name high school programs. And Bishop Gorman is still, in terms of the West Coast or even nationally, is still considered one of the very few elite schools in the country that has that kind of clout. If you're productive there, you're going to pick up some college attention.
And he certainly has done that. Excuse me. Sorry. Yeah, he's certainly done that. Coming up next on the show, we're going to keep John Garcia on. We're going to talk about a couple other prospects the Badgers are probably going to have to fend off some blue blood schools for. That's coming up next on Locked On Badgers. But first, today's show is brought to you by our good friends over at Underdog Fantasy. Underdog Fantasy remains the easiest way to spice up your college football, pro football weekend. Great way to just stack individual player props. We've talked about it a bunch on our Discord. Mike, who does awesome stuff on our Discord, is always stacking 4, 5, 6 players through Underdog, and you can get individual over-unders, Graham Mertz over 200 yards, Chimere Dike over 80 yards receiving, and you can stack up to 5 players for the weekend. And it's an easy way to make cash right away. No more waiting for the entire year to play out. You can make cash after a single game if your players hit. It's a lot of fun, and it's a little beyond just the betting the spreads. You can have find different leans, different angles, different players. Makes it really enjoyable to watch, really enjoyable to play along while you're watching your games. Easy to play, available in over 30 states. Again, just pick between 2 and 5 players across any team, not just your team, and decide if they'll finish higher or lower. That's it. It's simple. Easiest fantasy football game to play out there. And we have a great offer from Locked On. Sign up with our promo code Locked On. That's one word. Underdog will double your first deposit up to $100. You give them $100, they're going to give you $100 for free. That is UnderdogFantasy.com. Find the Underdog Fantasy app in the App Store, Google Play Store. Underdog Fantasy promo code Locked On. Get in on the college football pick'em action today. When you're done listening to Locked On Badgers, make sure you go check out Locked On Sports Today. From the games that matter the most to the biggest stories in sports. Go beyond the scoreboard, behind the scenes. Local experts and insight only Locked On can provide. Locked On Sports Today, available on this app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. I want to thank everybody again for tuning into Locked On Badgers, your team every single day. Really, really do appreciate it. We are going to waste no time here. Get John Garcia Jr. back on the show. John, definitely want to give you an opportunity. Where can people find your awesome work?
Real simple, SI.com. Another month is winding down, so we're going to refresh those college football recruiting class rankings. And all of a sudden, when November rolls around, we're a month away from signing day. So things are going to gear up plenty. So check us out, si.com/college.
Yeah, definitely worth it. Definitely somebody to follow from the recruiting scene if you want to get a little smarter, a little sharper. Brings great insight as always. I want to talk a little bit about a couple other prospects that you and I were discussing off air a little bit. Let's start with Christopher Terek, the big offensive tackle, a really highly recruited kid. Wisconsin nabbed him pretty early. What's the latest you've heard with Christopher?
Yeah, he's, another one that's in the Jim Leonhard camp. He's gone so far as to say there's almost an expectation that Jim Leonhard will be the guy, and that's what he's expecting. And he's doubled down on it. He's like, look, if Leonhard stays, if my position coach stays, that's is it Bosted or Bosted? Am I saying that
Bosted,
right?
Bob Bosted. Yep,
Bosted. If he stays, then I'm pretty much staying, which is a big deal, right? Because Notre Dame just offered him. They lost a big-time offensive tackle from the Southwestern region, and they need one more guy to complete their class. So they offered Chris, and it was like, okay, we'll see what happens. And boom, he took the visit up to South Bend for that Stanford game, and you could almost, hear the Notre Dame media rumbling up for a potential flip, but coming out of that, doubling down on Wisconsin, saying, hey, look, I hadn't been to Notre Dame. I wanted to check it out. They offered me. It was kind of just due diligence in that regard. Again, everything is still aligned with Wisconsin so long as Leonhard and Bostad stay as coaches on that staff. So, again, it's kind of remarkable, right? This is an out-of-state recruit and another one who you credit Wisconsin's early evaluation for, because other schools have since tried to get involved a little bit more and more after his recruitment rose. Yet and still, he's sticking with Wisconsin. It really is a matter of that final decision from the program, and that's just not something we see oftentimes with recruits. So they're basically saying, you stick with these guys, and we'll stick with this verbal commitment. So I do think he's one that one of the better players in the class, certainly, but probably one of the safest bets to stick with the Badgers, barring something unforeseen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting, right? Because Notre Dame and Wisconsin have had some battles over offensive linemen. That's one of those schools where, Oregon offering a skill guy, Notre Dame offering an offensive lineman. Does that make the battle a little harder when it's a Notre Dame? Obviously, that comes in.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's like you said, there's certain schools and certain positions that attract just more more talent, and it's a little bit harder to say no to it. I put Ohio State there at wide receiver, for instance. There's a bunch we could go through. So yeah, it is a little bit harder, particularly again with this is a Chicago area or Illinois native here. So all of that has easy ties there to Notre Dame and in terms of the Midwest powers. But again, early identification by Wisconsin, early scholarship offer, early prioritization, summer official visit. I think his first visit was to Wisconsin. So again, I think the long-standing recruitment of the Badgers angle here has something to say about it too. And obviously Wisconsin's no slouch when it comes to offensive line production in their own right. So I do think all of those things factor into why he's so seemingly solid to the Badgers. But yeah, it's still Notre Dame. He took the visit. We'll see if he takes another one. That'd probably be the big red flag in that regard, and or if other schools do elect to get involved and attempt a last minute flip. But look, again, we're in November. We're almost in November, right? So signing day is 6-7 weeks away at this point. So it's going to be a little bit harder for schools to jump in sight unseen with recruits unless they've got some kind of relationship with those kids, especially when you talk about offensive linemen. I think skill guys appear more apt to flip, even without that long-standing process. But offensive linemen are typically a little bit more old school. You got to put in the work to win those recruitments, and that's why most of them are already verbally committed at this point. On top of that, so again, I do think Notre Dame offers and presents its own angle, its own uniqueness. But Wisconsin can stand up to that, especially with a kid they've had on board since the summer.
Yeah, that's definitely good to hear, especially since Wisconsin lost Billy Schrauth to Notre Dame, last year. It was, keeping a kid away from them it would just feel good for Badger fans overall, the psyche of the fan base. Let's talk about another Illinois kid, Roderick Pierce. Versatile defensive lineman, can play inside and out. Another guy who committed relatively early. Where are we at with him? I know he picked up a Michigan offer, an Auburn offer. Auburn's been talking to him. Where are we at with him? Is he just a kind of another defensive guy that's probably going to be solid with Jim Leonhard?
Yeah, he's another one saying the right things, right? Particularly, like you said, defensive recruits, you don't worry about them as much because it appears as if the top candidate is your DC, and again, a Wisconsin guy through and through. So I do think those are in the Badgers' corner in this regard. But he's picked up a bunch of scholarship offers, right? Auburn, Michigan, Michigan State. He did say he was going to visit Michigan. So this one could have some interest going forward. But again, he is still saying the right things on top of it. This appears kind of like with Tarek, this appears to be due diligence. This appears to be, hey, they weren't really in on me. Now they are. Let me check them out. Let me provide that courtesy and reciprocate some of that interest while you guys figure out who the head coach of this school is going to be, and we'll kind of go from there. So I do think, again, Michigan on the field, obviously the last 2 years has really been elite and really great. Obviously the playoff, all that stuff, undefeated this year, but it's a new relationship, right? It's a new target, new offer, all of those things. So same thing for Michigan State and even Auburn in that regard. It's going to take a lot to move on from some of these recruits, or to move in on some of these recruits, because there's just an expectation that Wisconsin will be similar under Leonard as it was under Chris, at least from a recruiting standpoint. And again, as you mentioned, Ryan, kid's been on board for such a long time, right? I think that that creates so much more uphill in the battle it is to potentially, flip one of these recruits. If it's going to happen, you would point to a school that's just in a different trajectory right now. So I think Michigan would be the one to keep an eye on, just like we said, Oregon is for Trech. But I do think it's probably too little too late for Auburn and Michigan State. That offer doesn't feel the same as it did a year ago.
Right. I wanted to get your take on this because you talk to these kids a lot more, not just these kids, but high school players a lot more. How much does it matter that Jim Leonhard took over and instantly the program's momentum is a very short sample size, but they're 2-1. They pumped Purdue, they blew out Northwestern, they lost a close game. It feels from a fan watching, it feels talking to the players like there's more excitement, the momentum's picked up. How much does that matter to these players watching this closely?
I think it is tangible evidence of why there's this rallying cry to retain Leonard, just like we saw with, again, Notre Dame and Freeman last year. It's like instant gratification. You see more effort. It's more competitive. It's tangibly more successful, right? 66% win percentage in that 3-game sample. So yeah, even the only loss, as you said, close, overtime, all that stuff. So it's raised the bar from a competitive standpoint. Everyone appears to be bought in that regard, and it's tangible proof that this is who the players want. They're willing to play more for Leonard. I mean, it kind of, it's a 1-to-1, right? We see it. We saw before, we saw after, and it just looks different. It feels different, and I think that's why there's such an expectation that Leonard's going to get the gig. You don't tell recruits that almost unanimously, right? Because you can go down the list, even beyond guys we've talked about, and they're, hey, I hear Jim Leonard's going to get the job, or I think Jim Leonard's going to get the job. That's almost such a united front from the recruits angle that there's got to be a lot of substance to it, because you're not telling these kids something like that if it's not true. Like, look at Nebraska under Mickey Joseph. It's totally different. Like, they're not saying, oh, we think that, Coach Joseph's going to get the job and everything feels the same. It's totally different. And in fact, Mickey Joseph has gone on record saying, hey, we're trying to sell Nebraska to these kids, not necessarily us as coaches. So I think that reaction contrast between Nebraska and Wisconsin says a lot about the buy-in and the expectation, because it comes from the coaches, right? You don't, kids aren't going to reciprocate that if it's just the perception of the high school coach or the parents or the mentors or whoever. It's coming from the current players and the current coaches. All that stuff filters down. So for it to be so unanimous throughout the recruiting class, I do think it says a lot about the direction of this thing. And it's, again, part of the reason why all these kids are still committed.
Yeah, I think it's very well said. All right, coming up, one more segment with John Garcia. We're going to just finish up on the rest of the class, see if there's anybody else that sticks out to him that could potentially be someone to keep an eye on. That's coming up next on Locked On Badgers. Welcome back to Locked On Badgers. We have John Garcia Jr., Sports Illustrated's recruiting director for college football, Locked On's college football recruiting insider. John, I just kind of wanted to finish up with a few quick topics here. Anybody else just looking through the class, anybody else that you would keep an eye on as somebody that is either potentially thinking about flipping or that other schools are starting to look at a little more closely?
Yeah, I think we've hit a lot that other schools are trying to get in on. I remember when he committed, AJ Tisdale was one that I was like, he's from College Station, Texas. That's interesting, right? That's obviously where Texas A&M is. I don't know how involved they've been with him, summer verbal commitment to Wisconsin. So he's one I would keep a little bit of an eye on. But again, defensively, especially in the secondary, you feel like Wisconsin is going to retain these guys, right? When I saw the Paul Chryst news, my eyeballs first went to Jaquez Keys from in Ohio, because he was, flip. There was flip attempts even before Chryst was removed, and then Jace Arnold. My brain shifted to Jace Arnold out of the region in an ACC SEC hotbed in Atlanta. But again, he's a corner, a defensive guy who expects Jim Leonhard, another one on record, expects Jim Leonhard to be the guy. So it's really hard to imagine any movement with some of the rest of the class, barring surprises and new scholarship offers. So I think at the very top of it, Terek and Notre Dame is interesting, but not too much to worry about in my regard. I think Trech and Oregon is probably the one to keep the closest eye on, and then Pierce with Michigan. Let's see when he takes the visit. Let's see what comes out of it and how he handles the process going forward.
Out of those three players, kind of put you on the spot here, but out of those three players, we talked about Trech, Chris, and Pierce. Who is the Badgers' biggest priority to keep? Who is the biggest difference maker out of that group for the Badgers?
That's a great question. I probably would lean Pierce. I think physically he's the most ready to contribute from an inside or outside perspective, as you highlighted earlier. I think Trech is a niche slot receiver who can help an offense depending on what it's going to be, right? And that's part of the unknown here with Wisconsin in this regard. I mean, Tarek is a good tackle prospect, probably has right tackle upside as well. So I think he's certainly the second one on the list, but I just tend to think a versatile defensive lineman is something that is just so valuable. So Pierce, I think, especially with his size, is probably the guy that I'd keep an eye on the most closest of the three.
And definitely a spot that Wisconsin at times has struggled to recruit. Like you look at the big schools, it's too deep with defensive linemen. So in that aspect, yeah, it would make a lot of sense. He is John Garcia Jr., Sports Illustrated recruiting director, college football Locked On insider for the Locked On Network. Thank you so much, man, as always, for tuning in, for joining the show. I'm sorry, for everybody tuning in. Really do appreciate it. We're going to have more conversations tomorrow. As always, we continue building this Badger community up. And when you're done here, go check out Locked On Sports Today, the biggest sports news of the day on the biggest sports platform of the day. Instant reactions, big game recaps, and the take of the day. Available on YouTube, Odyssey, wherever you get your podcasts. John, thank you so much for jumping on the show. On Wisconsin, we'll talk to all y'all tomorrow.